What MDMA does in the brain is it does drive the release of serotonin along with other neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine and another one called norepinephrine or noradrenaline.
In thinking about MDMA as a treatment for these disorders like PTSD, how do we know that it's not just one more medicine?
There is an answer to that debate of, is empathy good or not? Is it good for society? And it's not even in my opinion. This is just like fact.
Narcissists many times know that they're narcissists, and they know exactly what it means to be a narcissist, and they don't care.
I always try to underscore this point that basically our brains need friends. Human beings feel better after interacting with each other.
Welcome back to the Webdelics podcast. It is good to be in your house today, especially because we have with us a guest that is extraordinary and that I am super duper stoked about. His name is Ben Rein. He is on Webdelics' own board of advisors, so you know he's got the gravitas, the credibility, and the credentials to make sure that this topic is both interesting and backed up by science. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here and to, meet you here and also to just represent Webdelics on Webdelics' own podcast. I've been working with the group for a couple of years now, and it's cool to finally join the show.
And it is super cool for us to finally have you here, especially in light of the topic that we're going to discuss today, which is MDMA and its relationship to empathy. Ben, before we go any further, just in case someone is watching the Webdelics podcast for the first time and they're just beginning to dip their toes into the world of psychedelics, can you explain to us exactly what MDMA is?
Yeah, so MDMA is a drug. It is a sort of adjacent to the psychedelic. It's not traditionally thought of as like a psychedelic because it's kind of different. The traditional psychedelics, the classical psychedelics, are usually like psilocybin, DMT, LSD. But MDMA is a really powerful psychoactive drug. It has really intense effects. Most people know of it as Molly or ecstasy, which is, most people know it's associated with this sense of euphoria and social connection. And of course, it is currently Schedule 1 illegal in the United States. It's been that way for a long time, but brief history of MDMA. It was first actually synthesized by Merck, as in Merck Pharmaceuticals, in 1912. This was not a drug that, was sort of made on the streets. It was actually made as a part of, I forget what condition they were trying to create new drugs for. I think it was like blood clotting, and they were looking for new blood thinners, I believe. And they synthesized MDMA, but they never tested it. Went to the shelf, sat there for like 60 years. And then in the 70s, this chemist, Alexander Shulgin, synthesized it himself because he noticed that it was similar to another very powerful drug called mescaline, used it on himself, was understandably very pleased with the effects, and so started distributing it, and people started sort of using it, mostly therapists actually in California, experimenting with patients and seeing how it affected them, noticing that it really has tremendous impact on people's relationships with others and how comfortable they feel sharing things with others and connecting with others. But then, of course, it became illegal, went, kind of by the wayside for a while until, about 15 years ago or so, when it resurfaced for its potential use as a clinical tool, specifically for PTSD. This study came out showing that it was super helpful for those with PTSD. And now it's basically back into kind of circulation as a potential therapeutic. It, all the while has remained, used illegally in the club scene and stuff because it creates that sense of euphoria. But yeah, I actually may have a lot of benefit as a clinical tool, and which I have not mentioned yet, but should have mentioned, it is one of the only drugs on earth that's known as an empathogen, meaning it enhances empathy. And I was very lucky to lead some of the work myself, some of the research at Stanford, where we uncovered exactly what brain mechanism it seems to be acting on to enhance that empathy itself.
Thank you for sharing all that. And for those who are not necessarily acronym fluent, PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. It is, as I understand it. I was diagnosed with this, by the way, due to some childhood trauma that I had. So that's why I have a little bit of above average knowledge around this. It is a response to severe trauma that people have, and it can lead to things like hypervigilance and a lot of stress and anxiety and even depression and things like that. Add on whatever you will about PTSD, Ben, because you are the expert. I'm just a guy that happened to live it, be told what my situation was by a therapist.
No, I mean, you summarized it well. It's exactly that. It's, it's a sort of sustained trauma response that starts with a traumatic experience, and luckily, we haven't gotten to the point yet of legalizing MDMA for use in PTSD, but there's a lot of research, really convincing research, showing that using MDMA for those with PTSD can be very helpful, and not only sort of reduce the severity of the symptoms, but have long lasting effects on those patients. And of course, I'm happy to talk about a little bit more about that and maybe what's going on there in the brain and whatnot.
Absolutely. And maybe we could begin to delve into that a little bit more deeply by discussing something that is embedded in the remarks that you've made so far, but not made explicit. So I want to make sure that I'm not drawing conclusions that have nothing to do with reality, which is MDMA can help with trauma response. In other words, with stress and psychological damage. But you also said it is an empathogen. You also described it particularly with regards to a lot of about how people view it in a non-clinical context as bringing about euphoria. So I can understand how bringing about a sense of euphoria can help mitigate trauma response and stress and anxiety. But you also seem to be saying, again, without directly saying it, that there may be a relationship between the qualities in MDMA that elevate empathy and this sense of euphoria that can have a healing effect on trauma. Am I indeed reading something into nothing? Please tell me I'm not.
No, that's a good question. It's a really astute question. So let me get one thing very clear. MDMA, in these trials that have been done for PTSD, they are not taking people who struggle with PTSD, giving them MDMA, and then just like releasing them into whatever environment they want. These people are not doing MDMA at Coachella, right? This is a
Thank goodness.
control. Right. This is a controlled, very controlled environment. It's a clinical environment where the patient is given the drug and is in the presence of a trusted therapist. And so what's happening in these trials is the person's actually doing talk therapy with a person that they already know, a therapist they already know. And the concept is MDMA makes everything so euphoric and incredible that for someone who has deep-seated trauma and traumatic memories, that euphoria may sort of dull the sharp edge. That euphoria may sort of dull the sharp edge of that memory so that they can explore it and think about it and talk about it with their therapist without meeting that intense negative emotional response that it normally brings about. And in doing so and having these really much more effective than usual therapy sessions, thanks to MDMA, they may be able to reshape their sort of idea of that memory and therefore reshape that trauma so that it's not so damaging. Now, the key there is the therapy, right? This is not out in Coachella. And this may be where that empathy comes into play, because in order to have an effective, therapist, and without, let's just take MDMA out of the equation altogether, right? Many people see a therapist. I see a therapist. I have a good relationship with my therapist, and I've had therapists where I have not a bad relationship, but a not so good relationship, right? Like you can have therapists where it just kind of doesn't click,
Yeah.
and that's a huge difference, right? Because when you have that, it's called a therapeutic alliance. When you have that relationship with your therapist where you actually trust them and like them and care about what they're saying, it makes the therapy a lot more effective. And so, if you are on MDMA and you're experiencing much more empathy with the person who you already generally trust, it may also enhance the ability to just sort of dive into the therapy with this person specifically, with any person, I guess, specifically, because you're experiencing so much more empathy and connection with that person as well. So there is a social element of what MDMA is doing to enhance therapy because it happens to be happening with another human being. And actually, that makes me think, I've never had this thought before until just now. It would be interesting to see whether MDMA enhances the sort of perceived therapeutic alliance or the relationship with an AI chatbot therapist, because I would bet that there's a human nature element there that is important. And I think that'd be an interesting study to do.
That would be amazing to have you back on this show talk about. And by the way, I want credit in that study if it happens. Please give
Yeah. Shout out to Scott Mason.
That is
It'll be the acknowledgments.
That's kind of surreal and totally wild, and it would be fascinating. Let me ask you this. How then exactly is this developed empathy being built out when a patient uses MDMA?
You mean in the brain or in
the brain?
Okay, so it's been known for a long time that MDMA enhances empathy, just sort of from like the outer observer level, right? Like you give someone MDMA, you ask them how they're feeling, you have them do some like empathy tests, and they say I feel more empathic. They score higher in empathy tests, right? So it's been known for a while that it does that, but it hasn't ever been really established what it's doing in the brain and how it's making that happen. And so the only real way to do this study is through animal studies, because you can give someone MDMA, put them in a brain scanner, and say, hey, they are experiencing more empathy and this brain area is activating more. So maybe that brain area is what's driving the empathy. You can do those observational studies in humans, but what you can't do is say, okay, MDMA is turning that brain area up, but what if we silence that brain area? If we manipulate the activity of the brain and we turn down that brain area, does the empathy go away? Because if it does, then that shows you that there's a causal relationship between that brain area's activity and the empathy. That type of study we can do in animals because we just have more experimental tools, and it's a totally different ballgame. And so when I was working at Stanford between 2021 and 2023 as a researcher in Dr. Rob Malenka's lab, this is exactly the study that I did. And what we discovered by doing these manipulations is that the empathogenic effects of MDMA are driven by one specific brain signal. It's serotonin being released in a brain area called the nucleus accumbens. And that's like gobbledygook, right? I just said a magical incantation in another language pretty much, right? Like what the hell does that mean?
$5 words.
So the nucleus accumbens is a very interesting brain area. It's a sort of like an old brain area you might think of. Like, people say that like humans have like this new brain, this like evolved frontal brain, all this. The nucleus accumbens is like a deep brain structure that is present in mice as well and all different animals, because it has a very like critical role in basically motivating behavior. What it does is it takes in all these signals from around the brain. It's very well connected, it receives a bunch of inputs. It takes all that information and it helps motivate our behavior basically based on the value of our options. So if you have in front of you, you're starving and you have on one hand a McDonald's hamburger and on the other hand you have, some popcorn, right? Like your brain's going to say you're starving, you are motivated to eat, you need nutrition. Let's go with the hamburger because it's going to have more protein. And that's what we need right now, right? That's your nucleus accumbens is going to help you make that decision by comparing the value of those two options. What's interesting is that when you think about social interaction, we also have to have signals in our brain that say you should socialize with this person, right? Like maybe this is a romantic partner, maybe this could be a friend, right? So the nucleus accumbens, when serotonin is released there, research shows that also drives like this decision to pursue social interaction. So if you stimulate serotonin release in the nucleus accumbens in a mouse, if you give them the option between hanging out near another mouse or hanging out near like an object, like a toy, When you stimulate that serotonin, they start spending much more time near the other mouse. They just become more social. They choose interaction. And what's super interesting is that that's the exact same brain signal that seems to be driving increased empathy. So probably what's happening is that there are multiple different receptors for serotonin. And I bet when certain serotonin receptors are hit, that's the signal to, hey, let's go hang out. I want to be around others. And when others are hit, it's another facet of socializing, which is empathy and understanding the emotions and sharing the emotions of others. So it's interesting because MDMA hits both of those. What MDMA does in the brain is it does drive the release of serotonin along with other neurotransmitters, specifically dopamine and another one called norepinephrine or noradrenaline. And so it seems that the effects of MDMA that make us want to socialize with others and be connected and experience more empathy, that seems to be related to just serotonin and just in this one brain area, the nucleus accumbens. And so the significance of this is it may be substantial because, on one hand, you can look at a study like the one I just described that I did at Stanford, and we could say, okay, cool. Now we understand how MDMA works. We understand a little bit more about empathy. But on the other hand, we could potentially use that information to create new drugs that are similar to MDMA, but let's say they only hit on serotonin. They don't touch dopamine. They don't touch norepinephrine. And so instead of the, intense sort of stimulant effects that we often see with MDMA, I mean, anyone who's done ecstasy or seen anyone on ecstasy knows, people are grinding their teeth, they're sweating, their eyes are wide open, they're running around. Like it's clearly a stimulant. That part is thought to be related to the dopamine. So what if we took all that out and we just hit serotonin? Could we potentially create a drug that makes people feel more connected, makes people experience more empathy, maybe makes things feel more euphoric as well? And could a drug like that be similarly effective for conditions like PTSD, but without having all the side effects of like increasing heart rate and, creating all this risk of side effects? MDMA is not necessarily a drug that everybody should be taking, right? It's if you have heart, conditions, it increases blood pressure, it increases heart rate. There are certain people who should not be taking it because it's a stimulant. But what if we could take that out? And that's a really interesting avenue to consider that we're kind of like right on the cusp of, right? Like we have the information we need to pursue that, but we're like nobody's really doing it. And or at least nobody that I know personally or have heard about is doing it. That may be happening out there somewhere. But I like to propose this idea because it's interesting to consider, like, should we create a drug like that? Would that benefit humanity? And how would it end up being used?
What would be the argument against creating such a drug? Is it just that it is derived from MDMA, which is bad, social noise, or what?
I think the argument against it is sort of an ethical argument. So, okay, that's a good question because in PTSD, it's pretty obvious, right? Like if MDMA works for PTSD and this drug works just as well, but it has less side effects, no kidding. Obviously, let's pursue that. But if we had a drug that made people more social, made people more empathetic, think about the other conditions where that could be applicable. Autism spectrum disorder, psychopathy, sociopathy, conditions where we have a sort of absence of caring for those around us in psychopathy, for instance, or in autism spectrum disorder, where there are changes in social interactions. And I think where it becomes questionable is who's making the decision about whether people with those conditions are getting this drug. Like there's a lot of how do I say this? In conditions that are life-threatening, it's very obvious that if there's a medication that can save their life, they should be taking it. But with something like autism specifically, there are many people who view autism as, not a disorder, but as something unique that makes them special and distinct, and it's like a superpower. And so the idea of giving doctors the ability to medicate something that may be viewed as positive and special to people, that's where it becomes really complicated. And it's sort of the same thing with psychopathy. It's like if someone with psychopathy and therefore has a lack of empathy is a perfectly happy member of society and they're not harming people, should it be a doctor's decision to medicate them for a problem that's not harmful but is recognized and is diagnosed? Whereas, that decision becomes a little bit easier if, let's say, that person committed a crime and assaulted someone, right? And they're dangerous. And so it's like, okay, maybe by enhancing their empathy, it will reduce their risk of committing another crime. That even gets maybe even more complicated and controversial. There's a whole lot of ethical questions surrounding the idea of how a drug like this is used, because there's nothing else like it, really. You think about like all of the drugs that exist are for things that people want treated, right? Like depression. Nobody wants depression, right? So they take medicine to help with their depression. Nobody wants anxiety. Nobody wants cancer. Some people may be happy with their level of sociability or empathy, even though it may not be sort of falling within the bounds of what a psychiatrist would consider healthy. And that's where it gets really, really complex and a little bit sort of scary to think about, in my opinion.
It is. And I have to insert here that, for instance, I have read literature that has indicated that those who study narcissists, another group that lack empathy, the narcissists many times know that they're narcissists, and they know exactly what it means to be a narcissist, and they don't care, or they like it. And I once read a biographical piece by a woman who claimed that her husband, who was a surgeon, had been diagnosed with sociopathy or psychopathy or whatever version of that, whatever the clinical term was. He knew full well that's who and what he was. He was proud of it. And he, as you pointed out, he wasn't killing anyone. He was a surgeon. He was saving lives on a daily basis. He was married to this woman. There was no evidence based on her account that she was being abused or anything like that. And so, yeah, are we going to impose from above? Is the government, which I assume would be the body that did this, sort of slam down this rule that people have to have empathy inside, and then it goes as to, well, okay, what would be the appropriate levels of empathy, and at what level of lack of empathy would you be required to go to the empathy camp and have your MDMA derivative forced on you until you achieved what level? It does sort of sound totalitarian and genuinely terrifying. But with all of that being said, then it leads into yet another question, which is, okay, is empathy itself something as a society that we even want to aspire to? Because honestly, right now, you see this a lot on social media. It's come up in cultural discourse, even theological discourse, very publicly in the past few years. The value of empathy in society is something that is being hotly debated in certain circles. And what would this mean to any discussion there? Would we be opening a Pandora's box? Maybe, I don't know, bringing too much empathy in the world? Is there even such a thing? Is that possible? I don't know. Ben, tell me. I need to know.
Okay. What I'm about to share is not even necessarily my opinion. And this is going to sound crazy for me to say, but like there is an answer to that debate of, is empathy good or not? Is it good for society? And it's not even my opinion. This is just like fact. That's controversial to say. Whatever. Okay. Empathy is a strength. It is very important for humanity. And the reason for that is because nowadays people think of empathy quite differently. They think of empathy as compassion, which is actually different. So compassion is the desire to help others. When you see someone suffering and you want to step in and help, that is compassion. And sympathy is actually a step down from empathy. Sympathy is when you're sort of seeing others struggle and you feel bad. Empathy is sort of in the middle of those, where you see someone struggling or experiencing something positive, whatever it is someone's experiencing, you take on that experience yourself. You start to feel the way they feel. And so we can think about, like, you picture the idea right now of someone slamming their hand on accident in a car door, and you can hear the thud of the hand being crushed by the door, and the blood starts coming out, and this is a gruesome image. And if you went there just now, Scott, in your head, and you put that image in your head and you really imagined it, you probably started to feel kind of shitty because of empathy. That is, when you witness someone suffering or experiencing pain, you start to feel bad because of empathy. You're taking on part of their experience. And by the way, there's actually evidence that seeing others in pain activates pain-related brain areas in the observer. So we're actually sort of experiencing a little bit of this pain. The reason that's beneficial is because when you see someone struggle and you start to feel bad, what does that do? It motivates you to care. It just basically forces upon you that you care. And so if that person is a part of your group, and the best thing that's possible is for the survival of your group, it's in your best interest to care and to recognize they need help and to step in and to support them. And so evolutionarily, long time ago, empathy is actually one of the things that allowed humans to survive and so effectively, is because we can basically read each other's minds. We can sense that person is hurt, I need to help them, or that person just stepped on that leaf and they are now writhing in pain. And so I don't know exactly what's going on, but I'm not going to step on that leaf. So it also supports your own survival. It's one of the key components of surviving in groups that basically made the most social humans the most fit humans. It's one of the tools that allows us to survive, or at least allowed us to survive a long time ago. So it is a strength for humanity. It's not a weakness. But as for your second question about is there too much empathy? Is there not enough empathy? I propose this idea that we are in what I like to call the Goldilocks zone of empathy. It's not too hot, not too cold, right? It's just right. So if we had less empathy, someone slams their hand in a car door, you don't give a shit. You just keep on going with your life. That's not good, because that person, let's say that person is your child, and maybe it's not their hand that got slammed in the car door. Maybe they got their body slammed in the car door and it's life-threatening. And if you don't care and you don't support them, that actually is bad for you, because you're now no longer passing on your genes and procreating. Your child dies. That's the worst thing that could happen. So empathy is obviously good, because if we had none, then it would be unhelpful. If we had so much empathy, though, too much empathy, at least a lot more than we had now, where let's say they slam their hand in the car door and you experience the sensation of your hand being crushed in the car door, right? You go 100% of the way there with them, feeling the exact same sensations that they experience. That would also not be helpful, because in that case, you are now in pain as well. And so not only are you not going to want to help them because you're, tending to your own pain, but in order for you to help them and to tend their wounds and to wrap them up or give them stitches, whatever it may be, you need to put yourself in through pain. And so you're actually disincentivized to help because it's too uncomfortable for you. And so this is why I propose this idea that we're right in the Goldilocks zone. We're right where we need to be in order for it to be beneficial. And so the thing is, with this debate of, should we medicate empathy? It's really only if it is to, a disadvantage, right? Because a million years ago, when it came to survival of the fittest, the humans without empathy were actually less likely to survive because they wouldn't be able to work as effectively in groups. But nowadays, that doesn't matter anymore. So if someone has low empathy, it doesn't really make a difference. I mean, they're, probably going to be a less sort of supportive, pro-social, contributing member of society. But as long as they're not harming anybody, there's really no need to medicate it, except to force that, that everybody should be within these bounds of acceptable levels of empathy. And I don't know. I think that the reason I hate this idea so much is because it creates another dilemma for humans to disagree on. And what I've learned through being a human alive in the world is that humans will always disagree on just about everything. For any given topic, you can find people who disagree with your stance, and there's always disagreement. And that is a particularly impactful concept where the ramifications would be significant. So yeah, I don't know. It's a bit frightening.
It is also related to a subject that brings up a lot of disagreement that leads people into the psychedelic space, which is the tendency, many would argue, in current Western medical culture to attempt to medicate everything. And so I can even hear people, let's say, MDMA is kind of mandated for everyone who either has some sort of suffering disorder that they need it for, or who doesn't meet this evil overlord nanny state requirements about empathy, right? It becomes something that loses or is a subject to backlash because people see it as one more pill that's being added to an already too large arsenal of pills. Which goes as to my next question. In thinking about MDMA as a treatment for these disorders like PTSD, how do we know that it's not just one more medicine that 10 years from now is going to be another version of SSRIs that everyone in the whole world hates and is running from like the plague?
Yeah, I mean, MDMA is super unique in that all psychedelics are unique in this way, that they are a single restricted, several hour long experience. And that's it. When you take your SSRI daily, you don't feel like, oh my gosh, like I could feel it flowing through my veins and I feel so much happier. And then later tonight, when it wears off, I'm going to feel worse. It's not like that, right? MDMA, psilocybin, DMT, LSD, all these drugs, these psychedelic drugs, they all create an intense experience. And during that experience, if you sort of use it wisely and reshape your thoughts about whatever it may be, that altered perception may stick with you. And so for MDMA, it's not something that people are going to have to take every single day at all. In fact, that would be unhealthy to take it that often. It would be more of a thing that you take a few times, maybe, I don't know. I mean, there's a bunch of different sort of studies showing different protocols and whatnot, but maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 times spread out over a couple weeks where you have, very helpful therapeutic sessions with a therapist, couple week break, do it again, couple week break, do it again, and then that's it. And then ideally you never do it again, or you do it once and then a couple of years later you do it again. And it's, in my opinion, it's impossible to even compare it to something like an SSRI because it's completely different. It's completely different. And I think that is what's so intriguing about psychedelics as clinical tools, is that there's really nothing else like them. And so it's almost impossible for like modern medicine and governmental bodies that make these decisions about whether it can be legal. It's almost impossible to even find consensus on it because it's like there's nothing to compare it to. There's no pre-existing reference. And on top of that, the fact that they've been explicitly illegal for the last 50 plus years. So, and, I attended I spoke at a conference in Iceland. It was the first ever psychedelics conference in Iceland in 2023. And Michael Pollan did an onstage fireside chat. And I stood up during his talk and I asked the question, basically imagine that MDMA, psilocybin, all these drugs, they were never illegal. They never even existed in the public sphere. Nobody knew about them. And then suddenly all these clinical trials started popping up showing, MDMA, 72% remission rate in those with PTSD, ketamine, psilocybin, remission rates for depression. And like, I think the public would be like, holy cow, this is unbelievable. Please release this to me now. Right. But the data are so strong there, the evidence is really, truly so strong. I say that to you as a scientist, and like at Stanford, everybody I spoke with, all the neuroscientists, we all agreed that the data were extremely strong for these psychedelic drugs for therapeutic purposes. But even still, despite that, even though they outperform our existing psychiatric drugs, they're not being approved yet because of the history. So in a world where they were never illegal, I think that we would already have seen them legalized. But the question I asked Michael Pollan is basically, do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing? Because obviously the bad angle is that we could have these drugs legalized, people could be using them clinically, but where they're not because they have this history. But the good thing is the drugs are going through such additional scrutiny because they've been illegal for so long that when they do meet the criteria to finally be used clinically, they will have more preliminary data than like any other medication ever going to market. And it's really quite an interesting dilemma. And honestly, I don't even remember what his answer was because it was a few years ago. I think I poured all my adrenaline into speaking my question to Michael Pollan in front of the entire room that I like zoned out for his answer. Um, but I wish I could remember it because I'd be curious.
I was going to ask you that, of course, is my next question. So let me move on to then the question that I had for after that, which is, again, you haven't explicitly said it, but let's get it out there clear and unequivocally. Is there any addictive quality inherent within MDMA?
There is a slight addictive liability. So here's the deal in neuroscience. In the brain, dopamine is the brain's reinforcement system. When you experience something pleasant and your brain wants you to do that again because it's good for you, dopamine is the signal that tells you to do that. So, when you watch a TV show you like and you're like, wow, this is so great, there's dopamine flowing in your brain. And then the next night when you're like, what should I do? Oh my gosh, I want to watch TV so badly. That's because that show drove dopamine release and it's reinforcing. It reinforces the behavior that you did. That's a psychological term, but it makes you want to do it again. So any drug that stimulates dopamine release technically has some addictive liability because the drug is, you take the drug and it's causing the dopamine release. And so your brain is saying, hey, this is good. We should do this again. And that's how you end up potentially in addiction. And so cocaine, highly addictive, acts directly on dopamine. MDMA acts on, I mentioned before, serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So there is potentially this liability for addiction. However, big however, super interesting. It's been shown that, despite driving really high levels of dopamine, MDMA is much less addictive than other dopaminergic drugs, other drugs that target dopamine. And it was recently found from my colleague Daniel Cardozo Pinto that serotonin actually suppresses dopamine release. And so since MDMA also drives serotonin at the same time, that serotonin may be pushing down the dopamine and basically blunting that reinforcing property. So even though it makes you feel good and it's driving dopamine release, it's maybe less addictive because there's serotonin at the same time. So long, complicated answer, sort of, not really, to answer your question.
That was really fascinating. I also relatedly have to ask, are there any other harm reduction concerns that are being explored with regards to MDMA and that people might want to consider as this presumably moves more and more to the fore as something people become aware of as a treatment for some of these mental challenges folks face?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's probably so many things out there that it's being explored for. I'm sure there are clinical trials all over the world testing MDMA for just about every condition that you could possibly imagine or circumstance that you can imagine. However, as far as I know, the only one that shows really strong data where it's like, wow, this is legit, is PTSD. And I think that's also just an important point to make in general, because I have heard people in the psychedelic space say, I heard one person at actually also at the Psychedelics conference in Iceland, I won't say who it was, but this person stood on stage during their talk and they said, what I think is going to happen in the end is that we're going to find that every psychedelic drug works for every condition. I could not disagree more with that because that's just simply not the case. Ketamine may be particularly effective for depression, but may not necessarily help with PTSD. And not to mention, let's say, Parkinson's disease, right? Like there's so many things that it would just not make sense to use for, because what it does in the brain just has nothing to do with what's happening in the brain in that condition. And so it seems that PTSD is like the target, the bullseye for MDMA, where it makes the most sense. It may turn out that it's also helpful for other things. And I'm sure it will. I mean, after all, you think about like it creates a sense of euphoria, right? And if you use that in the right way, I'm sure it can be beneficial for a lot of different things. But right now, I would say I'm really hovering around PTSD as the main treatment application.
I'm glad you said that, because it goes as to something that I have become sensitive to since beginning to host this podcast, which is just this idea that all of these substances that we generally call psychedelics, whether the classic psychedelics or not, are just sort of lumped together in this big sweeping category of sameness that really, really isn't true. Where do you see MDMA in particular uh, fitting within the larger cultural or therapeutic landscape in the future? In other words, let's say 10 years from now, the data continues to reinforce its viability as an empathogen and as a viable treatment for PTSD. And maybe, let's say, there's one or two disorders out there that maybe theoretically it could help. I don't know. But how do you see this being implemented in the world? Is it like a therapist would get a license to be a MDMA facilitator as well, or would you go to the local MDMA clinic, or would it be a prescription drug? Like, what would all this look like?
Such an interesting question to think about. I mean, first off, let's just get it out there. This all depends on the government, right? Whatever at least we're talking about America, the United States government, whatever they decide to do. But let's imagine, 10 years ahead of now, it's all been approved. All the drugs, ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, they've all been approved for certain conditions. I think that it could go two ways. I mean, I think I have a strong vision of like psychedelic centers where, there will be a center that basically offers MDMA therapy for PTSD, psilocybin therapy for depression, ketamine therapy for depression. Partially the reason I say that is because in order for a clinic to get approval to use one of these drugs, it'll probably be quite a hurdle because obviously these are really powerful drugs. And so once a clinic goes through the process of getting the approval for one, it's like you might as well just go through and get the approval for all of them. And not all clinics are going to want to go through that lengthy process, assuming that it's regulated to that level. But I think also what'll probably happen is like certain therapists will offer certain drugs, just kind of like in a more casual, like private clinic setting where, your typical therapist who you see or your psychiatrist, they might say, oh, I have the ability to also use, prescribe MDMA for PTSD. If you'd like to do a session, we can set that up. But yeah, I think that I don't know. I can't help but think that it's going to be mostly centers, and probably what it would look like is you would go into the center, you would do multiple sessions of sober therapy beforehand to establish a relationship with your therapist who you'll be paired with. And then at some point you go in, they administer the drug, you hang out. They probably have like some sweet lounge with couches and music and stuff. I'm sure it'd be very comfortable, and try to make it as less clinical as possible. And then you'd have therapy conversations with your therapist. And then you would do follow-up session like the day after or the next or 2 days after, where you go back and you'd sober talk more about what happened and what you went through. And I just think that model maybe makes sense because it's so distinct from traditional, psychiatry, SSRIs, benzodiazepines, the drugs that are meant to be taken like for indeterminate times. And considering that it's more of a one-off thing, it seems like it would be a specialty clinic, and it's just kind of interesting to imagine, that and these centers almost like I don't know, I picture them like yoga studios, like having like a cool like lounge area, but more private also, you wouldn't be doing it in a group setting. And I'm excited to see where it goes. It'll also be interesting to see how aggressively they pop up when that approval happens, because with like, when cannabis was approved, legally or medically, in a bunch of states, dispensaries started popping up all over the place. And that's probably different because you don't have to get an MD degree to sell cannabis, where you'd have to get an MD degree to administer these therapies. I think, by the way, that's also built into this. I think that it'll be MDs, doctors doing these sessions. And they'd be prescribed just like any other psychiatric drug, or any other drug in general.
That is a fascinating future to contemplate. There was this 1970s movie called Logan's Run that was set in the city of Seven Domes, and they had this place called the New U Shop. It was sort of a plastic surgery clinic where you could go and Farrah Fawcett would come give you a completely new identity. It was kind of stylish and cool. And when you are talking about these psychedelic clinics, I kind of imagine a more mentally health focused and less Farrah Fawcett-ish, more scientifically credible set of staff people in there changing people's lives. I'll also say that there's something personal that I wanted to share with you and the audience as we close out the conversation today. When I was in the throes of the worst pain that my PTSD brought into my life, I remember hanging out with a friend of mine who was so loving, so caring, who had things going on in her life that were challenging. But Ben, I was so caught up in the pain of my obsessive thoughts about the events that led me into this PTSD state that I couldn't connect with her. There was this PTSD based self-absorption that I was caught in. And I can't help but think if I had had greater empathy, I might have been able to take my mind off of my own suffering for a minute and be able to give more to this friend of mine who was so giving. And to me, that goes as to the thing that I will take away and remember the most from this conversation, except these psychedelic centers and clinics I want to go to one day, which is that empathy does have a Goldilocks zone. By being able to increase it and also utilize euphoria, it could take people like me who, because of our lack of empathy, were separated from the feelings and the humanity of other people back into the land of the living again. And wow, I needed that at the time. And talk therapy worked, but it wasn't the same as if I had just been able to experience something once and been able to be in a position to much more aggressively move on. So thank you for talking about that honestly, because I think that for a lot of folks that are either suffering from these disorders or know folks that are suffering from them, it can begin to enable them to imagine within themselves or within those that they care about something that's different. If there is something that you would like to underscore that you discussed with us today, or if there's something you'd like to say that you didn't get a chance to so far, Ben, what might that be, or what might those things be?
Just to echo off of your last comment there, I mean, human beings feel better after interacting with each other. You know, we are wired for connection. We have these social reward systems in our brains that make us feel good when we connect with others. And I think that we live in a world now where we are often more disconnected than we should be. And I do think it's affecting our health. It's something I take very seriously. And I think that, you know, Scott, for in your condition, in your situation you just described, you know, if you had been able to open up and connect more with your friend, I think it probably would have been good for you too. And so I always try to underscore this point that basically our brains need friends. And it's actually, I have a book coming out next month called Why Brains Need Friends that's about this. But basically just, I want people to understand how important it is for us to build social connection into our lives. It's not just important for our mood, it's important for our health. Empathy is definitely a piece of that. But anything you can do to strengthen the sense of love and connection and relationships you have in your life, it's going to benefit you in the long run. It may even extend your life legitimately. So please never forget about how badly we actually need each other. So that's my parting words.
How beautifully put. You mentioned your book. For those of us that are watching on YouTube, why don't you hold it up for us to see? And then maybe while you're holding it up, you can tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure. Yeah. I've got it right here. It's called Why Brains Need Friends. Comes out October 14th, 2025. And yeah, so the subtitle is The Neuroscience of Social Connection. And for those who can't see, who are just listening, has a picture of a hugging brain on the front.
I like that.
Penguin Random House brilliantly created for me. But yeah, it's all about this, concept of basically we have heard about how lonely we are and this loneliness epidemic and all this stuff. It's so important, but what does it all really mean? Like, what is the actual neuroscience of what's going on when we connect with others? What are we missing when we're isolated? How does isolation affect our brains in general? I tried to break down every possible question and confusion and concern that the average person would have about how important social interaction is in their daily life, and building as much neuroscience as I could into it, while also making sure it's accessible for anybody. Like literally the first page when you open it is I have a no big words clause where I'm like, I will not use big words unnecessarily. I hate when people do that. This book is for everybody, because I genuinely want to spread this message. So yeah, I'm excited for the book to come out and meet the world.
I like this no big word rule. I may have to start posting it everywhere. And in any event, I cannot wait to buy your book. Now, I know that between writing books, marketing books, appearing on podcasts, being on the Webdelics Advisory Board, you have a lot going on, but I have a feeling that is everything that I mentioned isn't the only set of things that you are involved in. So please tell us a little bit more about what you have going on in your life and where we can find out more about you.
Yeah. So in addition to what you mentioned, so I do post videos on social media also. I've, a couple accounts. Dr. Ben Rein is just my handle. And, so I do that science communication as well. I care a lot about science communication. I spent 10 years working as a researcher, leading the studies that I talked about here and a bunch more. And eventually came to the conclusion that really where I see myself fitting in is taking science out from behind the paywalls and the jargon and getting it out to the public. So I do that on social media. I wrote this book. I also teach at Stanford. I'm an adjunct lecturer there, and the class is called How to Communicate Science. So I'm trying to teach the next generation of scientists how to do this as well. I'm also a clinical assistant professor at SUNY Buffalo, and I'm the chief science officer of the Mind Science Foundation, where we fund research into the study of consciousness. So I do have my hands in a lot of different things, including the Webdelics Advisory Board, which I'm honored to be a part of. But yeah, and so if anyone's looking to connect with me or read into any more of my materials, whether it's my published research studies, God bless your soul if you're interested in that, the book or my social media, whatever, it can all be found on my website, which is just my name, Ben Rein. That's BenRein.com.
And if you didn't have a chance to just grab your pencil or pen out on the spot and type that web URL into wherever you needed to, do not fear. Webdelics is going to take care of you. We have all of Ben's information in the caption below this YouTube video and in the show notes below. Ben, I'm sensing a sort of Neil deGrasse Tyson of neuroscience in the house with me here. This has truly been a pleasure, and thank you for making all this understandable. It's wonderful having guests like you here on the Webdelics podcast.
Oh, thank you for your kind words. I really appreciate that very much. And I hope I may be the Neil deGrasse Tyson of neuroscience. That's a cool title.
Let's put it out there. It just might happen. For those of you who enjoyed this episode, be sure to press the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or just do whatever you need to subscribe on your favorite audio platform. Also, leave a thumbs up on YouTube and a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. We want to hear from you, and we especially love hearing positive things. Also, comments in the YouTube thread below this video. We want to connect with you, have conversations with you, and that's yet another way for us to engage. Do not hesitate to follow us on our social media handles. And then once you've done all of that, be sure to go to our website at webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. Sign up for our blog. We've got fascinating, curated, incredible articles coming out all the time. And then, above all else, once you've listened to all the past episodes of the Webdelics podcast, be sure to come back next time and listen to the next episode of this show, because we want you here at Webdelics all the time. Thank you for joining us.